It couldn't be the case that the truth involved a drug burn gone wrong, orgies with Hollywood elite, a counterinsurgency trained CIA infiltrator in the family, a series of unusually lax sheriff's deputies, and district attorneys, and judges, and parole officers, an FBI plot to smear leftists and Black Panthers, an effort to see if research on drugged mice applied to hippies, and LSD mind control experiments tested in the field. Could it? From page 395 of Tom O'Neill's book, Chaos, Charles Manson, the CIA, and the Secret History of the 60s. In reading this book, it immediately and frequently occurred to me that this is a story of opportunists, from Bugliosi to LA drug dealers, Hollywood celebrities to jingoistic federal employees, LA law enforcement to MKUltra researchers, and even Manson himself. All this hubris met up in LA, as is perpetually the case, for the glory and fortune of oneself. Before we analyze further the winding threads presented by Tom O'Neill's book, I want to give a brief review of the tome. First, as far as readability and engagement goes, the book is excellent. The writing was so interesting. I was typing my own notes as I read, and there were many times when I just stopped note-taking because I didn't want to distract myself from getting to the next page, the next unraveling of the onion. Second, the style is very winsome. I must admit that I am not very familiar with much mainstream true crime nonfiction, but I think this book is so much more than this genre typically connotes. It is written from the point of view of Mr. O'Neill himself, and covers his intensive quest for the truth to not only the real reason behind the 1969 Manson family murders, but also how much was obfuscated both during the trial and the half-century of pop culture narrative that has followed. The book begins with him receiving the assignment from a Premiere magazine in 1999. It was to be on the effects the murders had on the Hollywood scene, and it follows him to the present-day publishing of the book some 20 years later. In between, he elicits heretofore unheard of information from hundreds of interviews, deep dives into forgotten archives, and a rapport with figures intimately involved with the case on both sides of the law. As the author himself often states, he never made the initial deadline. While the nuggets of truth excavated by O'Neill have been said to be enough to overturn the murder convictions of the Manson family due to prosecutorial misconduct, mind you, O'Neill goes to great pains to be a neutral chronicler. And despite his admitted obsession with the tangled web of the Manson puzzle, which also includes documented connections to the MKUltra program and even the JFK assassination, the author is a mainstream journalist and not a conspiracy theorist. There can be no denying, however, the man's meticulous documentation and triple checking of the facts before committing to the published word. All this is to say that O'Neill does not jump to any definitive conclusion. A bit of the information he presents would be considered circumstantial, though highly compelling. And I can greatly respect this approach of his. Indeed, it is an approach I wish to emulate in presenting my personal analysis. And Mr. O'Neill has agreed to do an interview in early November, so I don't want to cloud anything with my own personal biases. It is for this reason that I initially struggled with how to present this information in my usual style. Primarily, I wanted this to be the nail in the coffin to one of our constant foils, the CIA. I was hoping the connection to MK Ultra and the Manson family to be ironclad. However, the author himself admits he never found the smoking gun. Also, the book provides so much new information and sometimes contradictory witness testimony that it would be quite a monumental undertaking to relate every lead O'Neill was able to track. As I mentioned at the beginning, however, it quickly occurred to me that if we take out the intrigues and some of the clandestine operations, we are left with a tale of selfishly cruel men. One of the most heinous crime sprees in modern U.S. history, as presented by Tom O'Neill, has a dizzying cast of characters. The one thing we can say, without a doubt, links many of the main players is that they saw in the horrific slaying an opportunity to acquire, to varying degrees, fame, notoriety, and or fortune in the City of Angels. I will talk about a few of these men and how their opportunism impacted our understanding, or lack thereof, of this convoluted case. The book opens with a prologue in which O'Neill is being berated by Vincent Bugliosi, the man who prosecuted the Manson family murders. For over 6 hours, the man chastised him. Bugliosi threatens to sue him for $100 million, among other vague threats. Now, Bugliosi is a man to keep in mind as you read this book, as he becomes the primary, albeit somewhat peripheral, antagonist. Bugliosi is opportunist number one in this tale. He became a household name and a sensation due to his prosecuting of the case. He wrote the book Helter Skelter immediately after the case, and it being the number one best-selling true crime book ever, it remains the primary source for what is thought to be the gospel truth for all things Manson and the Tate LaBianca murders. However, O'Neill uncovers information in Bugliosi's own handwriting that shows that he suborned perjury from at least two witnesses at trial, Danny DiCarlo and Terry Melcher. Only two that I could think of at the moment. There was so much crazy stuff going on in that trial, and with Bugliosi's on Bugliosi's end especially. In fact, Bugliosi himself stood trial for perjury for his actions in the case, for attempting to stifle media coverage of his shady dealings with this case. And I won't go into too much detail about Bugliosi's tyrannical and paranoid personal life at this time. I think, though, that the most important falsehood as it pertains to Bugliosi's involvement is his promoting the Helter Skelter narrative as the motive for the murders. Now, this is one of O'Neill's white whales. The author chases down many and varied potential motives for the crimes, but always comes away without that death blow. One thing becomes perfectly clear very soon into the book, however, and that is that Helter Skelter cannot be the true motive. It is almost as if it were cut from whole cloth, a Hollywood invention, a campfire tale Manson told his followers. Indeed, Bugliosi himself told a Rolling Stone reporter that he thought Manson did not even believe in Helter Skelter, but that maybe some of the women might have. Bugliosi, correctly so, saw the Manson family murders as his springboard into the upper echelons of true crime intelligentsia. In fact, he had his ghostwriter sitting ringside for the entirety of the trial. I have not read Helter Skelter, but O'Neill seems to me to be able to point out so many inconsistencies in that book that it appears to me to be almost worthless. A novelty read, perhaps. So, from whence did the race war story come? It becomes clear in the book that Manson was not the progenitor of this philosophy. As was already stated by the prosecutor, it is more likely something Manson did not take seriously. This is where the story begins to get a bit more circumstantial, but damn, is it interestingly plausible. Opportunist number 2 on this list are the research heads at the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic. Specifically for this entry, I'm referring to Roger Smith and Dr. David Smith. The Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic was a government-funded clinic that was frequented by Manson and his family during their formative time in San Francisco. They utilized the facility's treatment of Manson's and his harem's unwanted pregnancies and venereal diseases. But what else was provided for them at the clinic? Some of the research the Smiths did there was funded by the National Institute of Mental Health, which later admitted that at that time was being used as a front for the CIA's research with LSD. We all know what that means. Now, Roger Smith is an interesting one because he was Manson's former federal parole officer. At this time, Manson was in his early 30s, and he had spent half his life in federal institutions and penitentiaries. And despite being on parole in Los Angeles, Manson was able to relocate to San Francisco, and he and his family, many on probation, were able to blatantly break the law while seemingly being figuratively bailed out by Roger Smith, sometimes literally. This while Roger Smith was officially no longer a parole officer. And keep in mind that many of the CIA unwilling participants in the LSD mind control program were mental patients and prisoners. So, despite not being Manson's parole officer anymore, Roger Smith coincidentally winds up doing research at the Haight-Ashbury Clinic Dr. Smith founded, David Smith. The same clinic the Manson family visited daily and, in fact, lived around the corner from. Both Roger and David Smith were conducting research on the effects of LSD and amphetamines on the local hippie population. Both men would use the research to submit to peer-reviewed journals and acquire university positions and research grants. While both men would later downplay Manson's connection to the clinic, they both published books making mention of Manson shortly after the trial. Before we get to the final opportunist on the list, an honorable mention goes to the intelligence agencies of the United States. Let's give it up for them. Our usual suspects. Those of you who share my interest in topics will not be unfamiliar with the FBI's COINTELPRO and the CIA's Project Chaos. In all the mess of Hollywood orgies frequented by Manson's often underage sex cult fueled by drug use and government LSD research, were the tandem ongoing operations by the nation's intelligence arm. Both were highly active in the Los Angeles area. Despite their respective mission statements, in lay terms, they were intrigue operations and agitations against the U.S. citizenry. Both J. Edgar Hoover and Richard Helms were so concerned about college leftists and the Black Panthers that the psychological operation against the American people were of the utmost importance. Both operations directly led to cold-blooded murders of private citizens, murders spurred on and indeed encouraged by these agencies. Both operations would come under congressional scrutiny in the 70s. So, with this brief synopsis of COINTELPRO and Project Chaos, we segue to our final opportunist for today's show, Dr. Louis Jolyon West. Jolly West, as he was known to his friends, is the character, in my estimation. He is as close as the book gets to a smoking gun, I think. But there is so much obscurance and plausible deniability that, again, we are denied a definitive revelation. So, what do we know about Jolly West? We know he was conducting LSD and hypnosis research at the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic along with the Smiths. We know he conducted research on controlling human behavior at Cornell University. During the Korean War, he allegedly deprogrammed brainwashed POWs. We know he killed the elephant Tusko by overdosing it on LSD. We know he conducted LSD research on unknowing participants at air bases in Oklahoma and Texas. At a base in San Antonio, an airman with no prior violent history committed a heinous rape and murder of a young girl while he was in a fugue state. Jolly West was the psychiatrist who examined him and also extracted a confession for trial. O'Neill's deep dive into West's previously untouched archives reveals more. He was in intimate correspondence with the Black Sorcerer, Sidney Gottlieb, the father of MKUltra, the CIA's mind control program. In one such letter, West reveals to Gottlieb that he has cracked the code of hypnosis-based mind control and suggestibility. This was hidden from Congress completely. Also revealed is that the Foundation's Fund for Research in Psychiatry was a CIA front that funded much of West hypnosis and LSD research, including the work at the Haight-Ashbury Clinic. Moreover, Jolly West interviewed Jack Ruby alone and partly off the record prior to his testimony to the Warren Commission. The previously lucid Ruby was thereafter proclaimed by West to have suffered an acute psychotic break. It appeared to me that Jolly West was quite the heavy hitter in the MKUltra program. Again, the link between he and Manson and perhaps Manson's bizarre behavior, even by his standards, or even Manson's ability to use LSD and hypnosis to his own ends, it isn't there in stone. I think, though, that there's just too much smoke here to not be fire. West's opportunism presented itself in both monetary gain and personal glory. Not only was he well funded by the CIA for much of his career, he ascended to the ladder of academia as well. More than that, he was a real cold warrior. He had that particular brand of jingoism and messiah complex that saw nothing wrong with drugging and hypnotizing unwitting soldiers and citizens. Now, this is not an exhaustive list by any means of the evil displayed by many of the parties highlighted by this book. The master class of ineptitude put on by Los Angeles law authorities is another good example. There were so many times and so many laws broken by Manson that he should have been violated back to prison long before the murders. Every time he was bounced back to the streets. Even after the Tate LaBianca murders, the then largest raid in LA County history resulted in him being released without charges. Another Bugliosi lie claims the warrant was misdated. O'Neill found out that this was not true at all. I highly recommend this book. So much new information has been uncovered by Tom O'Neill. As I said before, it confirms and denies my Jussie Smollett video. Manson may have been a drug-addled, perverted dupe, but this notion of a racial animosity is definitely an agenda of our great Satan overlords. And even if you have no interest in Manson, this is just a fascinating story. It is another testament, in my opinion, to the hard work of going against the mainstream and realizing we've been lied to about everything we are expected to believe is self-evident. Just a reminder, I have been in communication with Mr. O'Neill and I'm trying to set up an interview in the next couple of weeks. I have been getting more back into the swing of things slowly, but I will have a video of my own type of odd news analysis before then. So stay tuned. Thanks for watching, and as always, Godspeed.